universities, schools, and education organizations to help inform their strategies. Anna is a global education strategist with deep experience in international student recruitment, partnership development, content creation, branding, and profile building. She previously worked with UC Berkeley Extension, the British Council, and EF Education First. She's also a columnist for Forbes and writes extensively on higher education issues. Our other panelist is Dr. Yong Zhao, who's the Foundation Distinguished Professor in the School of Education at the University of Kansas in the US. He is also a professorial fellow at Victoria University in Australia. His work focuses on the implications of globalization and technology and education. With over 100 publications and 30 books, Dr. Zhao's accomplishments, publication credits, and honors are simply too numerous to list. So I will just say that he's one of the most prolific scholars and writers in the field of education, while also being one of the most provocative, challenging us to rethink our paradigms and beliefs about education. So I'm delighted that both our panelists are joining us today. And with that, let me share a little bit with you about what exactly we're going to discuss and why. And the survey whose findings we're sharing today is called the IC3 Institute Student Quest survey. And its intent is to capture the perceptions of students who are not already in college, but are at that very critical threshold of making a transition from their secondary education into post-secondary education, and already beginning to think about their futures. And the reason we have called this the Student Quest survey is that it is for students, it is truly a pathway that begins as early as high school as they're thinking about their futures. And as educators, our role in helping them succeed through that pathway does begin as early as school. So that is our Student Quest survey. This year, we covered over 2,000 students, high school students from India and Nepal. And I want to emphasize that while our respondents do reflect most of the major boards in the region, we have a predominance of CBSE schools represented in our sample, which also reflects the actual population of schools in the region. I do want to share the caveat that we realize that the population of schools and students in the region is very large, very diverse, and that our survey perhaps does primarily reflect students in more urban areas, and certainly students with access both to the English language and technology, which we know is not always accessible in certain parts of the country. So I do want to emphasize that. Now, why India and South Asia? Why did we focus on this region this year? If we look at numbers, in South and Southeast Asia alone, there are 433 million students between the ages, or youth between the ages of 14 and 19, of whom 350 million are in India. And then if we look at where demographic growth is going, it's clear that the world's future talent pool is going to come from this region as well as Africa. So how these students make their decisions about their futures, how well equipped they are to make these decisions, has implications not just for the regions themselves, but really the entire world. I also want to mention that our survey comes at a very critical point in time, where we have seen two major developments come together. The first, of course, is the pandemic. And while we did not start out, when we envisioned the survey, we did not start out with the intent of this being a survey about the impact of COVID-19, but any discussion about education today cannot be had without the framing of COVID-19, because that is indeed what has disrupted education significantly. So we did have a portion of the survey where we looked at how COVID-19 has actually affected the students' plans, and we will talk about that. But the other big development, a more recent one, which I think is very critical for the findings, is that after a period of 34 years, India just released a new national education policy recently. And there are two aspects of that policy that really align well with what we are trying to surface through these findings. One is that there is a very clear focus on a greater alignment between academics and careers and vocational education for students, which is exactly some of the ideas that we're exploring here. And then the second is an increased focus on the internationalization of Indian education, and particularly Indian higher education, which of course has elements of both attracting students to India as a destination, but also an effort to have students stay in India in the country's own higher education institutions. So with that framing, I'm now going to turn it over to Anna, and actually right before I do that, a quick note on the structure and how the session will flow. Anna's going to take a few minutes to talk about, highlight some of the findings around education in our survey. I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about the career-related findings. We're going to invite Dr. Zhao to share his thoughts on some of what we are highlighting. And then we go into an open, a moderated discussion amongst the three of us on some key issues, following which I'm going to take some questions from the audience. So we do invite you to share your questions as the webinar proceeds. So Anna, with that, over to you.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Rajika. So as Rajika said, I'm going to focus on the education-related findings to the research. We're actually very, very interesting. Our first slide here reflects the desire to pursue higher education. There was a lot of talk because of the pandemic that many students would choose to take a gap year, sort of to assess the landscape. But what we see here, as you can see from the pie chart, is that it really hasn't had that impact, that students either want to pursue higher education in their home countries or to go and study abroad. A small percentage have said that they will take a gap year before pursuing higher education overseas or at home. But as you can see, a significant number of the students who were surveyed, they will continue to that pursuit. To be honest, these are young people, and what they can really manage to do in reality may be a different scenario, but at least the aspiration and the drive is very apparent in this particular slide. The next slide is about their reasons for studying overseas, which are actually quite familiar to some degree when you're talking about this particular cohort of students, that they are looking for quality of education. That has been a driver. I've been surveying international students for a while, particularly with the British Council, and one hallmark trait of Indian students as a whole, and again a generalization, is the reason for pursuing study overseas, which is a financial commitment, is to pursue quality. The second most cited reason was that overseas institutions provide a more flexible curriculum, and that also the third one, which actually is a theme that resonates all the way to what Rajika's presentation will be on, is the correlation between studying abroad and professional success. That could also be reflected in the fourth most cited reason, which is the prestige of a foreign degree. That may be from the employer's perspective, that having an overseas credential will give you a competitive edge in a very competitive and increasingly globalized sort of landscape. And it's important to know these reasons are, I think from an institutional perspective, are very important to heed. India is forecast by the UN to take over in terms of the most populated country over China in 2024, and the middle class is forecast to total 500 million in the next decade. So and half of the population is under the age of 25. So obviously a very attractive recruitment market for many institutions around the world. So the next slide are factors, more specific factors affecting the choice of destination. Again, the quality factor. We asked the students to rank a variety of factors from very important to not important. Here, obviously, 81% had said that the high quality of teaching is one of the factors affecting choice of destination, not a specific destination, but an overseas destination. Affordability is number two. Understandable, even in the best of times, studying overseas, it involves a lot of expense in terms of tuition, room and board, traveling, often families coming to visit, students going back and forth for the summers or holidays. So that is, but even more so now with the pandemic's impact on the economic state of affairs globally. And then third, the opportunities available after studying, including work. As you know, that in 2012, when the UK rescinded post-study work rights, the number of Indian students headed to the UK for overseas study plummeted. Since I think it was in I don't remember exactly, a few years ago, the UK did reinstate the post-study work, and again, Indian students became more interested in UK as a study destination. So obviously the opportunities, and maybe not necessary to live in that country permanently after study abroad, but the ability to have a few years of experience working there, to put on their CVs, to understand how the global workplace operates is invaluable for a lot of students. The fourth is the number of highly ranked universities, which obviously may be in the earlier slide, the prestige of having a foreign degree. So these are all factors affecting the choice of destination. And it's important to note here that there are a lot of what you would say are pull factors, which are the draw of overseas study destinations for this cohort of Indian and Nepalese students, rather than the push factors, which are often reflective of what might be perceived as a gap or a shortfall in the provision that's offered at home. So this actually is an interesting dynamic, which would change the way institutions reach out to these students. And actually, it becomes much more challenging if what's at home is not necessarily what's pushing them to go out. Okay, so the next slide is the factors that are reasons not to select a destination. Again, these are quite interesting. I feel very reflective of the current state of affairs right now. The concern about personal safety and gun violence. Personal safety has always been, and increasingly over the past few years, not a deterrent, but a weightier factor when students make decisions to study abroad. Concern about high crime rates, which actually can be tied in to that as well. Concern about racist attacks. Again, this has always been a concern, but perhaps more now. There have been very well publicized reports of students studying overseas who have been somehow correlated with the outbreak of the virus, who have been obviously unfairly sort of focused upon. And unfavorable immigration policies, again, as we know, recently in the United States, a lot of talk about the future of H-1B visas for OPT, which is the ability for students to work for, I believe, a year after graduation, and that often can lead to a job. So, and then again, you might recall that there was talk that if international students had an entirely online course of study, that they would not be allowed to physically be in the United States. That was an ICE policy that was rescinded, and then it was actually implemented for first-year students, international students. So I think that kind of uncertainty and stress for students obviously has become quite a concern for students. What's interesting to note in this slide, at the bottom of the bar chart, is the distance from home is not a very big factor. I thought that was quite interesting, that their concerns are more about what will happen if they pursue study abroad. It really wasn't the pull of being at home with their families and feeling sort of safe. This to me indicates a kind of bravery, maybe, that even despite this current global health crisis, that students that drive to go overseas, not driven by anything lacking in their home countries, is quite powerful for these students. So anyway, I thought this was a very, very interesting group of findings. The last slide that I'm going to discuss is the top destinations. Again, the US is number one. We asked students to pick, I believe it's their top 5 destinations, and the US was picked as the number one destination by 75%, or picked by students as their top destination. What we found interesting, however, is that the UK and Canada they gained a great deal of ground, which could be indicative of that quality, that the influencing factor of quality, that perhaps this group of students really is pursuing quality, not necessarily in the United States. Obviously, a huge draw in terms of technology to study at the world's top engineering schools, to get internships, to do OPT, or to work in the Silicon Valley. This is a dream for many students around the world, not necessarily just from this part of South Asia, but to pursue opportunities to get that quality education, that prestigious degree in the UK, in Canada, in Australia. 41% picked Australia, and we also saw a number of students picking Singapore, 32%. And again, maybe affordability, the concerns about personal safety. Singapore, very safe place for a young person to be on their own. So that to me may be a little bit, this slide may be sort of encompassing all the factors that we had seen prior in the slides that I discussed. And so now I'm going to hand it over to Rajika to discuss sort of the more career-based findings that are actually, this is great context for what Rajika is going to share with us.
Thank you, Anna. And I want to ask Dr. Zhao, should I talk about the career-related findings and then have your reflections, or is there something you would like to jump in and share on what Anna just spoke about?
I think go ahead, share with all this, then we can have a good discussion. Thank you.
Sounds good. Great. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we see as the drivers for students thinking around their careers and how they're making decisions. And really, I'm going to just focus on a few things that stood out to us. Hopefully all of you have seen the report or will read it after this webinar, so I won't go into a whole lot of details. But as we looked to what's driving the thinking of students as they look to the future and the workforce, it's not surprising that these students are very strongly influenced by their family. This is something known, I would say, not just for Indian and Nepalese students, but more broadly for Asian students as well. But we also see a strong role and influence of the media as well as their teachers. I think what surprised us the most in this portion of the survey, and here I point you to the graph to your right, is that what seems to drive students the most as they think about their future jobs is their passion for the job or industry, as well as their assessment of whether they think they will actually enjoy what it is that they will be doing in terms of their future profession. And this surprised us because I think the stereotype of the Indian student is, the Nepalese student is, that they are driven primarily by pragmatic considerations, such as either job stability or more traditional careers, or the financial returns on for a job or a career path. But here actually we're seeing that these students are assessing their future options very differently. They're engaging in what seems to drive them, and that emerged at the top, and that we see sort of this desire for a pursuit of fulfillment in what they wish to do in the future.
Rajika, I think that there is a Clay Hensley raised his hand. He might want to ask a question. Do you want to take that?
Sure, I can do that, certainly. Clay, would you like to put your question in the chat box, and I can then go ahead and take that question? So I'll continue till I see Clay's question here. Let's see, I don't spot the question, so I'm going to keep going. Okay, so Clay says that was by accident. But Clay, please do think about what you might want to ask as we get towards the end. So just to return to this, we think we see a different kind of student emerging here with different drivers and motivations, and that this really also has implications for schools as they help students prepare for their futures, that as students seek more fulfillment in their careers and what they pursue, this is going to mean that from a perspective of guiding and counseling students, the onus is really on schools on how do they tap this drive and energy on the part of students and help them shape it in the form of viable careers. I want to turn next to looking at what sort of guidance students were receiving in schools around careers. So when we asked students about how important it was for them to receive career counseling and guidance, 50% of them strongly agreed that this was critical, and about 44% agreed that this was a very important need of theirs. Yet, when we asked them whether they felt the current guidance that they were receiving was adequate to make their future decisions, only 15% agreed that it was adequate, which again really points to this gap, this need, a large need, but also a very clear gap around how much students are really receiving clear guidance around making their future choices about both post-secondary education and how that post-secondary education is actually going to lead to their career of choice. And then the last piece I want to share around what we found for careers. If you may move to the next slide, please. Is this idea of what sort of sense of clarity do students have about their future careers? And here the most noteworthy finding was that we had really expected that there would be a difference amongst younger students and older students, so as defined by grade level, that you would think that students who are in the 12th grade and about to enter the world beyond high school would have a much clearer sense of clarity, have much more clarity around what they wish to do in the future. But in fact, we did not find any difference between, say, a 9th grader's responses and those of a 12th grader. We think this is an important finding because what it possibly means is that even to the extent that students are receiving career guidance in school, that guidance needs to be intensified and tailored to the needs of students as they advance into those final grades before they will actually enter a post-secondary education after school, and are more sort of are poised to think much more clearly about their career futures. I want to move now to this last piece that I'll share with you very quickly. And as I mentioned in my opening, it's impossible to talk about either education or careers today without the impact of the coronavirus. And so the way we approached this was to take a look at how it's first sort of how is it affecting these students' plans, but also what is really changing in their mindsets and how they're looking at this situation currently and beyond. So what we found was, and again, keeping in mind that the survey was conducted in June and July, and the whole situation with the pandemic has been so shifting and so fluid that this picture may have already changed somewhat. But what we found was that over half of them felt at the time of the survey that it was really too early for them to know what the full impact would be. But a further quarter said that it had indeed affected their plans. And in terms of how it's affected their plans, for many of them, it's meant having to now consider online education options. It's also meant not being able to attend the colleges and universities that they had planned on going to, whether it was at home or abroad. But I think the more important findings, and if you may move to the last slide, please. The more important findings are really around what is the mindset right now? What are they feeling right now about the future? And here we found what we would describe as a certain resilience. And what I mean by that is that there is a strong desire for things to return to normal. There's a certain optimism about the future, despite the ravages of the pandemic. There's also a very clear indication around the role of online education. There's been a lot of speculation in our sector on whether online education is now going to entirely replace in-person education. And what we find in this survey is that, according to this group of students who responded, that it is probably a band-aid, but certainly not a solution, and that it will not replace a traditional in-person classroom. And it is certainly for them not a good substitute for classroom or campus-based experience. And I thought that was very interesting. So with that, I'm going to quickly move it into our discussion, and perhaps this is a great segue to bringing in some of Dr. Zhao's perspectives, because you've done so much work on the role of technology in education. And so maybe we start with this idea that, as you saw in that last slide, clearly the teenagers who participated in this survey seem to have mixed feelings about online education. Yet it is a reality that online learning is here to stay. And so how would you say schools and educators should deal with this, and sort of the reality of expanding online learning, yet the need for something more? What would be the path forward as we think about the relationship between online learning and more traditional instruction?
Well, thank you. That's a very powerful study. I enjoyed it very much, and it was very nice to get a glimpse about students in India and Nepal. And about online education, I think if you look at their response, it reflects the reality that many of them had not had online education before. And they might have been on YouTube or other things, but not as a formal way of online education. So I think many institutions, many schools have not done a good job in online education either. They just put things up there. They may think schooling is just teach a class, but online education is much more than teaching a class. I think many schools just did online. You take this class, then you're done with it. So I think institutions should reflect on how they do online education. Online education, if it's in combination with in-person, is actually quite powerful if you do it the right way. The second thing, of course, I think all the students, you did this in June, July, they just got started. And they themselves have not settled to say what I can learn from online education. And then that is, I think, maybe if you took it, if we had another, lockdown for another year, took another year, that may change their perceptions. But also, remember, there's teenagers, there's students who are eager to hang out with their friends, to get together in a community. That's a very strong piece. That's why in the US, many universities, even though they don't want to, they still have to organize in-person classes, because social learning, hanging around, is very important. And the most of our life for humanity is we have developed more face-to-face, in-person communities, and losing that is very significant. If the COVID-19 lasts another 20, 30 years, then we might learn how to get used to it. But I don't think that's very possible. But I think the biggest lesson I would learn from this is really not two things. There are two lessons. One is that institutions, schools have to do better with their online offering, and do not lose that even when they do face-to-face, because online learning can add to the richness of learning, and if it's redesigned. Second thing, I think, as students, it also shows that there may be, a lot of students today are online all the time, but they may not be doing what schools want them to do. they may be just entertaining. So how do we guide them to think about online and offline as part of life? Would be very interesting.
No, thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah, definitely. I think that for schools, it's been a period of sort of really, again, I think that shift from a nice add-on to now the virtual and online piece being absolutely fundamental to the learning. To the learning, and I would also say that it opens the door to things that some schools and teachers were doing, such as bringing in other parts of the world directly into the classroom through technology, and now all of that has become possible to a much greater extent.
Yeah, I was also quite surprised and pleasantly surprised at how aspirational the students are. That's very close to, I would say, to many developed countries. I think is that the idea of going to college, going up, study abroad, that's very, very impressive. That means, but also it may mean that institutions of higher education have to change as well to address that. But also I think our students may have been, I actually mean this globally speaking, every student try to follow the school pathway. I go to kindergarten, I go to elementary school, I go to secondary school, I go to post-secondary school. There might have been a loss of student self-determination or students as owners. Because we just have, when we are born, we're educated just to follow this model. But this model may not work in the future. We might see a collapse of higher education. Even if you go there, it may not give you what you are looking for. For example, a job you desire, a job you would like to do. I'm very concerned already about that because, going there, finish 4 years of college, we have also an inflation of college degrees. We see a changing world. I'm quite concerned about that. I'm happy to see this. We want to do more, but also I'm quite concerned about would that lead to where they want to go.
If I can just interrupt there, that's an excellent point. And I think at the same time, the marketplace, the economy is changing with the tech disruptions or the jobs that maybe the three of us aspired to when we were graduating from university will not exist for this cohort of students or working remotely, gig economy, obviously huge focus on tech skills. I think for a long time, learning English was such a big driver for international students to study overseas. But I think that the ability to learn tech skills, to be creative, to be sort of resourceful, there's a lot of skills that students are looking at right now to attain. And as the survey indicated, that the students want to become more competitive professionally, but as Rajika said in her presentation, they want more ownership of what they do afterwards. So it's not about being a doctor, a lawyer, those traditional pathways that international students wanted to pursue so they would have financial prosperity. It's something a little bit more profound and as a result, harder to sort of target from an institutional perspective.
Yeah, so no, absolutely, and you both made a very important point, and this is exactly the sort of challenge that we are currently dealing with in this space of career and college counseling, and how to that in this moment in time, how can schools and teachers guide students for a future world of work where industries have essentially been disrupted. And already, even before the pandemic, and Dr. Zhao, I know I've read this in some of your writings as well, where you've said that they're essentially preparing students for a future that will not exist. And, that's been sharpened even further. So as we think to that future where we're not necessarily now going to know which industries and which specific jobs are going to come out at the top, do you have some thoughts on specific skill sets or a combination of skills? We've already beginning to talk about, the 21st century skills that, that language was already around before the pandemic. But what can schools do to still equip students with, that effective, almost quiver of arrows? I'll use that analogy, that when they're out in the world, they can quickly pivot from one situation to another and still be successful.
Well, I think if you look in the US right now, or actually most developed countries, how many college graduates are underemployed? That's a massive number of college graduates, especially because of COVID. That means if you have a degree in drama, but you're working at Starbucks, or you have a degree in computer science, actually, if you're in the wrong way, you will not have a job. You may be driving the Uber. So if that's available. So I think I would really first of all encourage a lot of our students to analyze. We have overproduced college graduates, even though people say, oh, we need future jobs need a lot more college graduates, which may or may not be true entirely, actually. So I would really advise my students to say, what can you do? Because I think one thing I've been arguing, for example, today, if you have an idea, if you're really good with ideas, you should go start a business or go start doing something. That's as an entrepreneur. You actually can learn and can do and has been done. That may not apply to everybody, but that's a possibility. Or if you are really interested in technology, you look at Microsoft has programs in training your skills. Google has programs. I'm not advocating for everybody going the same direction. So what I was worried about, everybody trying to go to college. And many colleges are struggling to survive. Honestly, many colleges, their programs not necessarily preparing you to be in the profession, but colleges, of course, should do more research. Colleges have a different role as well. There are different colleges. Some colleges really drive the basic research. Some are dealing with the humanities. I think we should have a diversity. India, as I said, it's a huge country. I'm looking at 2,000 students. China is a huge country. America is a huge country. So we need to really go back to look at individual students with their own passion, with their own strength, with their own context to advise them. I think right now advising everybody going to college might be a mistake. Colleges are needed, but not 90%, not 95%. I think that's really something that worries me. So I think schools now should develop ideas to help students to learn on their own, to be your own learner, to own your own learning, to be able to develop basic capacities to manage your life, but then develop a unique profile of skills and knowledge, content, including what we call creativity, everything that you are unique and you are uniquely available for certain types of jobs, that including jobs you create for yourself and for other people.
That's an interesting point about the aspirational bit, maybe not matching what's on the ground. As you mentioned, too many university graduates. I guess a question I like to throw to both of you is, I think a lot of that comes from parents who equate a university degree, particularly at a branded institution, as quote unquote success. Maybe that will ebb with the sort of tech disrupted sort of jobs marketplace. But I noticed that one of the questions on the chat is the role of parents. Rajika, I don't know whether or not you want to speak about that as well from the IC3 Institute perspective. Do either of you think that role of parents decreasing in this world where students have more ownership, that they are more creative, they're entrepreneurial, or is that, and maybe you could speak about China too, about the role that parents traditionally played there, and how if the Chinese students have also gone through these different iterations in terms of their aspirations.
Rajika, you want to take it first?
Yeah, sure. And thanks for picking up that thread, Anna. And I'll just acknowledge Priya Wadhwa, who's asked that question essentially about, the role of parents and, what their role, not just in decision making, but how are they feeling about this current situation around reopening. So I'll share that the role of parents from our perspective at the Institute and the work we do is absolutely critical. In fact, one of our core strategy is or approaches is implementing something called the counseling laboratory, which has been developed by our founder Ganesh Kohli, where one of the key pieces of the work we do with schools is bringing in the parents also, because in this work we have realized that changing the parental mindset is absolutely critical in helping them see that when their students have certain interests and aspirations, which may seem off the beaten path to them, that they can actually lead to viable and exciting, yet viable and lucrative careers for their children. So absolutely, I think altering the parental mindset is a big piece of it, and really bringing them into the process of working with schools and students. In terms of sort of the other part of this question on, how are parents feeling right now, I think that's a really good point that's been raised, that, overall, I will say in our sector and how we've dealt with this, we've been talking a lot to the experts, and we've been having a lot of these sorts of conversations, certainly trying to talk to students and school leaders and university leaders. But I think parents have not, the feelings of parents have not been sought as often. And I will say that anecdotally, what I hear from colleagues and friends who are parents themselves is that there is this real desire of sort of a return to normal for their children, as well as a great deal of trepidation with their children potentially going back into environments where we still don't have a vaccine. And so I don't know that we have a lot of good data around this. If Anna and Dr. Zhao know of more current evidence around this, I'd welcome them to share that. If anybody in the chat box, please chime in if you know of some good evidence on parent surveys. But let me turn it back over to you, Yong.
Well, I think, Anna, you asked a good question. Let me just say first one is about China. I think you might see the similar kind of data from China. If you survey the urban, the more advanced regions, schools, again, China is a huge country, and we get everybody wants to go to college. Parents definitely drive that. I think parents drive that. The thing is this: we've been living with colleges for a long time, and many parents did not have the opportunity to go to college. Now they have the opportunity. They want to make sure they can send their students to college. College somehow is like a dream. You go, something good will happen. I think that's really interesting. People say, you go to college. If you look at the best years in life, many people had are in colleges, because that's the time you're celebrated, you're happy, you have big ideas, dreams. That's because we lived our life like that. Parents want them, especially parents who did not go to college before. I think in China that happened, and that's happened in India. So they want them, of course, give the best. That's the best you can. I mean, in China, even they will say, okay, after college you get nothing. Then what do? You go to master's degree. And then you go to so they want you to finish all the degrees. That's what parents are used to. They're familiar with. They want the best for their children, and which is right. But I think that's why I worry about it. I said, what if we all go to college? Let's say 90% of our graduates go to college. There are plenty. I mean, in the U.S., Anna, you know this very well. 4,000 colleges. Some of them are really bad. Some of them are, okay. And you go, you spend 4 years, you spend $100,000 in college, sometimes $200,000 in college, and then what? We've seen a lot of situations. If a family have a lot of income, doesn't matter, as an experience, you're buying an experience, that's okay. But if everybody, 90% come out, then they drive a Uber may be automatically driven in the future. They don't need human beings. Even the gig economy may work a little bit, not working. I think, that's a very, very interesting question to ponder for parents. I do think the information needs to go to parents, but also, not only parents, all our schools, the good schools, I bet, a lot of the good schools take pride in their ability to send students to colleges. So they want to nurture that mindset to say, we are very good. 45% go to college, to go to Ivy Leagues, others go there. I think we took pride in that. But what I'm really arguing for, which may or may not happen at all. Human beings are quite stupid. Human beings are not the smartest people, seriously, because we will collapse until we reach that point. And that's why how many civilizations collapsed in history. They collapsed because they cannot see the future. Everybody tried to push through the same direction. But anyway, my point is that we may not be able to correct this. We may not be able to change our mind. We're all going collapsing through the same model. And then what happens? Just imagine actually in India, if you get 60% of your population to have a college degree, what's going to happen there? So that's the interesting way to think about.
I told you all that Dr. Zhao is also provocative, so I think we just heard some of that. But thank you for those remarks. So I'm going to take before I take Clay Hensley now does have a couple of questions, and before I go to Clay, I just want to read out a comment from one of the panelists, Maria Dholkawala, and this goes back to one of the points we were making earlier of what are those actual skills students are going to need to succeed. And she observes that keeping in mind changing trends, we need to prepare students for live interviews and with a much greater focus on language and personalities and personality. And this is so true, because if we think about what students and young professionals and more seasoned professionals are being called to do, there's a very strong place for self-expression and public speaking. And that is certainly emerging as a very critical skill that can be parlayed in different ways in different careers. So thank you for that observation. So I'm now going to go to a question from Clay from the College Board, and he asks, he's curious how some of these findings, particularly related to the US, will shift based on the results of the upcoming US presidential election. So, Anna, should we maybe have you tackle that, start with that, and then I'm sure both of us will have some thoughts to share as well.
It's a great question, Clay. It's funny, I think we didn't cover that specifically in this survey, but in terms of sort of more anecdotal observations, I think for a student, as Yong mentioned so succinctly, that students really want to go to university for that personal experience. So I think until they won't make decisions based on something sort of macro, like an election, but they will make something based on how that manifests itself on the ground. So if somebody is elected and that results in more restrictive immigration policies, more fears about racism, et cetera, I think the decisions would be based more on that than who was elected. So we have to wait and see how that translates in terms of that campus experience, which, at least from this study, is so important and much more so than online. I agree 100% with Yong that a more mixed, diverse curriculum will serve everybody, not just students, but institutions, because there will be other disruptions, whether it be another pandemic, some geopolitical problem, that they need to be able to pivot and not reinvent the wheel every time something happens that disrupts face-to-face learning. So, obviously we will find out the answer, maybe not in a couple months, but maybe in a year, when the full impact of a new or continued administration is felt with students, not just students on campus, but international students. And it's the whole cycle, not just what's on campus. How hard is it to get there? How much is that going to cost? What is tuition looking like then, which is not necessarily connected with the election, but what's going to happen? I recently wrote a Forbes piece about whether or not U.S. college tuition will keep decreasing. That it decreased, I can't remember the percentage, but from July to August, most likely because Williams, Princeton, a number of universities cut tuition because of the curtailed semester. But what's going to happen next year? Are they going to just jack it up again, making up for lost ground, or will it continue to accommodate student concerns? So we'll see. I don't know, Yong, if you have what your opinion on that is.
Well, I always love Clay, So Clay, good to see, hear from you. I haven't seen you for a while. But anyway, so you ask a very challenging question. Well, my view is this. I don't think students in China, India, Nepal are as closely engaged with the election as we think. They may read a little bit. I don't think they know. But I think the U.S., however, anti-immigration policies are dangerously affecting student bodies overseas. If you look at the survey results, I look at the top one is still US, and then UK, Canada, and Australia become very big. But in terms of capacity, US has the biggest capacity in higher education. So that should have really draw a lot more. I don't think UK and Canada and Australia can accommodate all the student interest. So I think that's so I'm very concerned right now about the US immigration policy. And maybe the election of Biden might continue that because of the US general sentiment. I'm very worried about the US right now returning to maybe pre-World War II. That is, we want to become our own best and we're our own selves. I think that's really going against historical trend. But this election might be important, in that regard. But I am not sure it's going to change our immigration policy for a while, which gives me a lot of concern.
Yeah, and I would just reiterate, to what both of you have said, to Anna's point, I absolutely agree that it is not so much the specific election or its outcome, but really how is that reflected in policies. And that's what students are really sensitive to, and that entire set of policies. And our survey very clearly shows that on how important the ability to work after education in your destination country is important to students. So Anna's already mentioned that whole pathway from the OPT to, I would take it further and say that entire pathway from beginning with the OPT, but then transitioning to an H-1B and then the green card. And I think those are the things that students are really sensitive to and watching really closely. And, the UK has been a prime example of that when they restricted their post-study work program, there was a huge drop in Indian students going to the UK. When that was reinstated, the numbers went right back up. So we see that very clearly in global patterns. But, I think that to Yong's point, in a broader sense, there's just been, there's just been a huge impact on the overall perception of the US. I will say, though, that, I think something has begun to shift in the awareness of students also. And I think like some of the other developments this year, like the Black Lives Matter movement, and has really, I also feel, raised the level of social consciousness of students who are either already international students in the US or are thinking about coming to the US. And I think that's important, sort of that greater awareness of what the social context is that they will be entering when they decide to study in a country. But, this is taking us down an interesting path, and I want to pivot this a little bit to again sort of this broader issue of geopolitics. And one of the questions I'd like us to tackle, and Yong, maybe we start with you, is that bringing this back to COVID-19, do you think that COVID-19 is going to have an impact on the overall global landscape of where students seek an education? And are we perhaps going to witness some sort of realignment of geopolitics and which countries sort of rise to the top in terms of their students, both their student bodies and mobility? So looking, usually the comparison that's made is India and China. But would you like to share some reflections on that piece?
Thank you, Rajika. I think I'm glad Clay is in the audience because the College Board is very concerned about this. So I think the COVID-19 has highlighted a number of geopolitical issues. You look at the US-China relationship, China with Australia, China with the European countries. I think there will be shifting away attention from China for a while, and that may actually shift towards India. And so that's, I think, a big change. You look at the Israel and a lot of Arabic countries forming relationships, that may be a different culture change as well. I think there's a lot of things in the move right now. In 2 years, I think the world would be different from what happened in, let's say, 2019. I think there will be a realignment of geopolitics, a realignment of globalization. And actually, I was just wondering, given the lack of access to U.S. universities, would U.S. universities be more active in building campuses in India? There may be more foreign institutions in India, because you have students who want to study. You have people have the money. They want to do it. They have reorganized this. And also maybe in 2 years, institutions in the US or maybe in Australia will be shrinking themselves. And once they shrink, if they laid off the staff, they cut the programs, the students may not be able to get in. Then where do you want to go? So you have this demand, you have supply, and it's a very interesting dynamic. I think globally speaking, I'm really actually excited about what's possible, but also quite concerned about what's possible. I think the new geopolitics after COVID will be quite interesting to watch, and they will definitely affect the students you surveyed.
It's interesting from a simply logistical point of view in terms of, let's say, international student recruitment. I'm talking more from a grassroots level. I think that universities are all suffered. I'm speaking from the US perspective, but I think globally, they've all lost a tremendous amount of money. I think the University of Michigan, one of America's most prestigious state universities, they've estimated that they will lose up to $1 billion due to the pandemic. And all of the traveling that universities are doing to recruit students on the ground, the number of flights have decreased dramatically. Yong, I'm sure you know that. I think the number of direct flights from the United States to China it's just incredible. It's a mere fraction of what it was. What's available weekly is now maybe a morning, back in at the end of 2019. So I think there's so many other factors in addition to the macro factors that you mentioned, the finances, the availability, there'll be layoffs and furloughs. And then on the student side, the aspiration is there, but is the money there, the finances there? And then if all of the recruitment is being done remotely through online discussions and webinars, how impactful is that versus physically going and talking to students and giving them swag and all of that sort of face-to-face interaction that at least historically has been key to successful recruitment. So the challenges abound. I agree that it will be a different, maybe even before 2 years, maybe when we emerge somewhat in the spring at the end of this academic year, we may all be the landscape may be very different. Rajika, I don't know what you think in terms of what the near-term or long-term future looks like from all these sort of angles.
Yeah, there's a lot to be observed and said here, and in the interest of time, I'll just pick up one of the points that Yong made about how this will perhaps open up opportunities for other countries and for countries like India. And this is exactly, what part of the new national education policy in India is about, where it really is about strengthening up. We've already seen phenomenal growth in the number of innovative private institutions in India over the past 10 years, and institutions that many students are now considering as their first option and not just a backup option. And I think you're absolutely right that, with everything else going on, with sort of push from the policy side as well, which we didn't actually get to talk about enough, we may see the rise of countries like India and their systems. And a few years ago, a colleague, Alessia, and I wrote a book called Asia, the Next Higher Education Superpower, and we had a question mark at the end of it. And I think that perhaps we are approaching that point where there may not be a question mark any longer. with that, I want to be mindful of time. I saw one question I want to quickly answer right here live. It's a quick technical question. Somebody asked whether we whether we analyzed the data separately for Indian and Nepalese students, and we did not, because we recognized that the Nepalese sample was, while critical, was much smaller than the Indian one, so a comparison wouldn't be in order. And with that, I want to thank my co-panelists, Anna Esaki-Smith, Yong Zhao. I want to thank them, deep gratitude for bringing their perspectives. And I want to thank all of you for joining us today. And I want to thank the entire IC3 team behind this, who puts this on and brings us to you in this webinar. And I want to thank them as well. So thank you, everybody. And I hope you enjoyed the discussion.
Thank you. Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.